Manhwa title, I picked up a hammer to save the world. After defeating the Demon King Army's 7th Corps commander, Gluttony, Tiny was on the brink of death. The destruction of mankind seemed inevitable, but his comrade, the Sword Emperor, used the power of an heirloom to send him back in time. Tiny found himself as an orphan in the slums, stripped of his former glory as the strongest knight on the continent. However, he discovered he had gained new powers that he did not possess in his previous life. With this newfound strength, Tiny sets out to prevent the extinction of mankind. Join him on his journey as he sets out to protect humanity's final resort, the sacred relics, and face off against a black magician determined to see their downfall. Will Tiny be able to change the course of history and save the world? On a stormy night filled with blood and death, the world was doomed. The 10 strongest knights, who once guarded the continent, had depleted all their life force and mana. Above the vast stretches of contaminated land, only death lingered. This devastation had been caused by a single entity, Demon Commander Gluttony. But if Gluttony was only the 7th commander, just how powerful were the other commanders and the Demon King? Tiny was the only one standing, ready to fight against the Demon Commander. Gluttony was impressed by Tiny's strength, but despite his efforts, he could not defeat him. With his final blow, Tiny managed to kill Gluttony but depleted all of his mana in the process. He began to question himself, wondering if he had done everything wrong from the very beginning. He had faced countless failures, advanced slower than everyone else, and risen to the top of the knights from the very bottom. If only he had trained with proper methods from the beginning, he could have saved the continent from destruction and saved everyone. After the battle ended, the Sword Emperor called for Tiny. He was also out of mana and on the verge of death. Sword Emperor asked why Tiny didn't run from the battle since he heard that Tiny was from the slums and had nothing to protect. Tiny replied that he hated being unseemly the most and believed a man should be confident everywhere. He wouldn't run for the love of God. Sword Emperor laughed, impressed by Tiny's words, and decides to trust his talent, which made him one of the 10 strongest knights with pride alone. Sword Emperor revealed he could use a power of heirloom to send one person to the past. He shared that his daughter's birth name was Lila, named after a flower that he and his wife liked, but he never liked that flower very much. This detail was important, so Sword Emperor urged Tiny not to forget it and to find him as soon as possible. With the Sword Emperor's guidance and his new powers, Tiny sets out to save the world from destruction and prevent the same mistakes from happening again. As Tiny's consciousness started to fade, he suddenly found himself transported back in time, lying in bed with his beloved sister who had died protecting him. 2 men barged in and callously kicked her body while bragging about themselves. Although they knew that she was already dead, they still tried to take her body. One of them asked why he was bothering with a corpse, but the other replied that there were sick individuals who enjoyed dead bodies, and that organs and fresh bodies could fetch good cash. Despite his best efforts, Tiny was unable to move his body and watched helplessly as the 2 men desecrated his sister's remains. Suddenly, he managed to activate his mana and move towards his sister to protect her. He knocked down one of the men and managed to cover his sister, but in doing so, he angered the 2 men, who proceeded to beat him mercilessly. After they left, Tiny felt like he had awakened from a nightmare, but he realized that he had been sent back to the past with the power to change the future. He wept bitterly, wishing the Sword Emperor had sent him back just a little further so that he could have saved his sister. But he knew that he had been given a second chance to make things right, to give his sister a proper funeral and a peaceful rest which he couldn't do in previous life. Remembering the Sword Emperor's words to find him as soon as possible, Tiny decided to first seek revenge on the thug who killed his sister. He gave his sister a proper funeral and was comforted by the thought that he had honored her memory. 1 month later, the time had come for Tiny to take his revenge. He approached the thugs who had come to his home before and asked for the whereabouts of their boss, the wolf. The thugs become angry, and one tries to slap Tiny, but he catches his hand and breaks his arm. Another thug was scared by his presence and attempted to fight back, but Tiny easily defeated him. Tiny reveals that he had developed a secret technique in his previous life by fusing his mana body and physical body perfectly, giving him immense power but also requiring him to consume much more food. He catches one of the thugs by the leg and swings him into the building where the rest of the gang is gathered. As Tiny enters the room, he finds himself surrounded by cold, hostile glares. He grabs one of the thugs and uses him as a weapon to defeat everyone in the room except for the Ronners brothers. A red-haired man drew his sword, and Tiny challenged them both to come at him. Realizing that Tiny is a mana user, the man and his companion get excited at the prospect of selling the corpse of a mana user for a high price. The two men leap towards Tiny. However, in his previous life, Tiny's master had instructed him to have some class and not to use a person as a weapon. Instead, he taught him hand-to-hand combat. As the men attack, Tiny saw through their movements and dodged their attacks, countering with a punch to one face and a kick to the other. He beat them until they were unconscious before heading toward the wolf, the ruler of the invaders. In his previous life, Tiny had been surprised to discover that the wolf, who had been a pimp in a remote area, belonged to the Beastman tribe, which was considered the best among the demi-human race. Among them, the pure silver werewolf was special, manifesting only in the direct lineages of the royal family. It had been hard to kill him in his previous life, and he had never figured out why there was a silver wolf in this place, but now it was time for him to find out. When the wolf realized that Tiny was the one who had attacked his men, he became angry and transformed into his original form, confusing Tiny because the wolf lacked silver fur. Tiny mocked him, saying what kind of puppy he had become. Although the wolf was faster and stronger than the Ronners brothers, he could not be compared to how he had been when Tiny had fought him in his previous life. In a disappointment, Tiny caught the wolf's mouth and squeezed so hard that the wolf's mouth got crushed. In his previous life, Tiny had heard from a fellow beastman how to deal with kinfolk in their berserk state. It was all right to beat them up a little since beastmen had excellent regenerative ability. Tiny beat up the wolf until he came to his senses. The wolf asked Tiny why he was doing this to him, but Tiny replied to shut up and beg his sister for forgiveness for what they had done. He beat up the wolf until he fell to the ground. As the wolf was apologizing, he saw a strange stone he had never seen before. He picked up the stone and sensed a demonic chi coming from it. A pure silver wolf appeared in front of him from the spirit stone. Tiny broke the weird-looking chain that was sealing the silver wolf, and he could see a memory of the wolf. The silver wolf had been surrounded by strange men, all of whom had the demonic chi. Those who had a demonic chi were called demon worshippers who rejected the goddess and worshipped the demon kind. They had killed the silver wolf and extracted the spirit stone from it. They were creating beastmen by making people absorb the spirit stone. Wolf had been created by the demonic organization, but since Tiny had come too soon, he couldn't absorb the spirit stone completely. The silver wolf was furious with Wolf and was about to kill him, but Tiny intervened and told the silver wolf that Wolf deserved a more miserable death. What amazed Tiny was that the silver wolf could understand him even though Tiny had no talent for spirit taming. He recalled his comrades mentioning that only young children with pure souls and enough mana could bond with spirits. Even though Tiny was young, he didn't consider himself pure. The silver wolf offered to form a contract with Tiny, provided Tiny helped him take revenge. This pleased Tiny since he was planning to kill all those related to demonic chi anyway. The silver wolf was given a name by Tiny, Lunar Wolf, because of his silver fur, resembling the moon. Wolf was still out of his mind, but Lunar Wolf gave him a sharp jolt, bringing him back to his senses. Tiny inquired about the men who gave Wolf the spirit stone, but Wolf simply grinned eerily and declared that he was their test subject. He was about to divulge more information when he was suddenly killed by a powerful enchantment placed on his mouth by the demonic chi guy. Back when Tiny lived in the slums, a princess named Chloe von Valencia gave him a golden ring, instructing him to use it to find her for help. She was known for her kindness and generosity, and had earned the nickname Valencia's Angel. With the help of the ring, Tiny could easily get close to the Sword Emperor. A guard commander named Lam arrived, and everyone informed him of the mana user's misdeeds, hoping that he would resolve the situation quickly. Lam saw this as an opportunity to increase his protection fee from Wolf. Tiny appeared from the first floor and admitted to causing the commotion. Lam was furious, and demanded to know if Tiny realized what he had done. Tiny replied that he had taken care of some rotten individuals, and didn't see why a knight had to get involved in such matters. Tiny also asked if Lam was receiving bribes from Wolf, which irritated Lam. Lam attacked Tiny, but Tiny effortlessly redirected his attack and demonstrated his power with a kick. Tiny dodged Lam's subsequent attacks and realized that he couldn't afford to make an enemy out of the estate lord, given the large number of knight troops under his command. Instead, Tiny decided to make Lam leave on his own. Tiny intimidated Lamb with Lunar Wolf, and after calming down, Tiny offered him money to prevent the situation from escalating. After some bargaining, Lamb agreed to a compromise of 1.5 gold coins, and everyone wondered if he would just leave like that. Lamb silenced them with a punch to the face and left. Everything is going according to Tiny's plan, so it shouldn't take more than a week to take care of this place. He's looking forward to meeting with Duke Valencia, wondering what will happen to the estate lord of Files who has been making a fool out of the Duke. With this account book, the estate lord of Files is finished. Tiny has arrived at the estate lord of Files palace and gets to meet the Grandmaster of Files Night Order, Kron. Tiny starts to get on nerves of Grandmaster as he lectures him for letting his guests stand. Kron says Tiny needs to know where he is standing, but Tiny tells him to not screw around with him as if he is the superior of the estate lord. Kron gets furious and tries to get his sword out, but a maid stops him from doing so. Kron controls his anger and takes Tiny to meet the estate lord, but he plans to kill Tiny as soon as he gets the estate lord's permission to do so. Tiny enters the room and greets the ruler of Files. He is shocked when he sees the lord because the lord he knew in the past was fat and addicted to drugs. Regardless of his appearance, he was a noble in his previous life and he is still a noble. Anyway, the account book that is headed towards Duke Valencia will finish the estate lord for sure and Tiny will finally get his proper revenge. The estate lord asks why Tiny didn't show Kron the same respect he showed to him. Tiny replies that one's attitude towards their master and one of the master's servants cannot be the same, and he aspires to become one of the estate lord's servants. Shocking them both, the estate lord says that Tiny considers the order's grandmaster his rival, but then he says in a serious tone that for someone who wants to be his servant, Tiny has robbed him of his money. He asks how Tiny would care to explain that. Tiny replies that he did it for the estate lord's own good. He informs the estate lord that Duke Valencia has started a crackdown on drugs and prostitution, and he acquired this information from Lady Valencia during her visit to his land. He wanted to clean things up for the estate lord before it got messy. The estate lord starts to get confused as he has heard about their plans for something big during the coming-age ceremony of their youngest daughter. Kron tries to inform the estate lord that these were just false thoughts of a child, and that Valencia is full of warehouses, but the estate lord orders him not to overstep when he is talking. After analyzing the situation, the estate lord says that despite the methods being rough, they were something to be complimented. But he says there is one more thing that he has to make sure of. He asks Tiny if he controls the spirit of the wolf and if it was a spirit he stole from the wolf's spirit stone. Tiny was caught off guard, not knowing how the Lord of File had discovered the secret of the lunar wolf. Using the wolf's eye, he could see a circle made of demonic energy, which revealed the Lord of File to be a dark magician. Tiny knew that devils never lend their strength without sacrifices, and a second circle magician like the Lord of File was certainly a lunatic who had killed hundreds of people or made dozens of live people as a sacrifice. He recalled the thugs mentioning that there were some sick individuals who enjoyed dead bodies and the Rundell brothers saying that the body of a mana user could be sold at a high price. Tiny realized that the man who had been purchasing corpses from the invader was the Lord of File. The Lord of File asked Tiny why he was not replying, to which Tiny responded that he did not understand the question. The Lord of File then summoned his knight, who drew out his sword. Tiny called for his lunar wolf, but he knew that he could not defeat the two of them together with his current power. The Lord of File acknowledged that things had turned out his way, and they would need a new test subject. Estate Lord asked Kron how powerful Tiny was. Kron stated that Tiny would soon reach level 2, meaning he was already on par with a knight. Kron also noted that unless he was from a notable family who trained him how to manipulate mana from a young age, he must be a genius. He added that there was no way possible that Tiny learned all this on his own, as not a single string of his mana was leaking, and the mana circulation was quite stable. Tiny responded that he had learned this from his family's secret legacy before he came to Files. He explained that it was a breathing technique that he had learned since infancy, and due to the recent increase in his strength, he had realized that it was a special method. The Lord of File seemed more interested in Tiny now. Tiny wished the Lord of File good luck in finding out whether it was the truth or not, as they had accepted refugees from all places to increase the source of income for Invader. Therefore, it would be impossible for them to track his records. The Lord of File said to take his word, but he would determine Tiny's details. Tiny wondered if the Lord of Files reference to he was one of the formidable members of the Dark Magician, which could be dangerous for him. However, Tiny still had a card to play. It would take around 3 days for the Duke's men to identify whether the account book was genuine or fake, another 3 days for the punitive army to be assembled, and another 10 days for the army to reach Files, totaling a little over 15 days. If the estate lord's guest arrived after 15 days, everything would work out as he planned. Tiny asked the Lord of Files when his guest would arrive, stating that he needed to know so he could learn the appropriate manners. The Lord of Files replied that the guest would arrive in a week and warned Tiny not to disappoint him. Tiny realized that he had two options since the Lord had said the guest would arrive in a week. His first option was to flee. If he wanted to escape, he could easily lose the estate lord's men, but doing so would put him on the wanted list, causing problems when he attempted to meet the Sword Emperor. Knowing that he needed to meet the Sword Emperor, Tiny needed to avoid anything that might cause future problems. Although he lacked the strength to defeat his opponents at the moment, finding a way to overcome them had always been his way of doing things. The second option was to consider the guest's arrival suspicious. The estate lord had addressed him as if he were some high nobility, but the house was empty just before the guest's arrival. Tiny concluded that it was a shady private visit, and the backer of the estate lord was someone who couldn't show their face in public. Tiny thought about what might happen if a massive unforeseen event occurred in Files, drawing all the attention to the place. The guest's visit would likely be postponed or cancelled, although this plan presents a high risk. However, this was Tiny's way of doing things, and to make it work, he needed to become strong enough to defeat the Grandmaster and the Lord. Feeling hungry, Tiny sat down to eat, shocking everyone with his large appetite. They began to wonder if he had dwarf or orc blood, as they were known to eat large amounts. For Tiny, eating improved his mana body, making him stronger with every bite. A knight approached Tiny, asking if he was a homeless kid who had learned manners from a dog. Tiny replied with a nonchalant yeah. The knight warned Tiny to act respectfully when meeting an adult, but Tiny responded with a laugh, asking if he should respect someone who was picking a fight with a little kid. The knight didn't take kindly to Tiny's response and threw a punch, destroying the table Tiny was eating on. Knowing that the Grandmaster and estate lord were behind the attack, Tiny provoked the knight further, telling him to go ahead and find out how strong he was. They stepped outside the restaurant to duel in front of the villagers, and the knight was excited for the opportunity to fight Tiny. The knight challenged Tiny to pick up his sword and asked if he was scared. Tiny responded to the knight's attack with a swift kick to the leg, causing him to feel pain and lose his balance. He then dodged the knight's punch and retaliated with another kick to the other leg. The knight was left powerless and amazed at Tiny's skill, despite being just a level 1. Enraged, the knight lunged at Tiny, but he easily dodged by sliding between his legs and leaping back towards his head. Assuring the knight that he wouldn't kill him, Tiny defeated him in front of a crowd, making them all wonder how a little kid could overpower a knight. By intentionally defeating the knight, Tiny increased his chances of success and making the feudal lord hesitant to get rid of him. Later, the estate lord summoned him to the castle and revealed that the movements of the duchy were confirmed to be true. He served Tiny a steak and other dishes, but Tiny claimed that he had already eaten a big breakfast. The lord then complimented Tiny's strength and the rarity of his black hair and eyes, hinting that someone important would be arriving soon to explain further. He assured Tiny that this guest would be the one to give him an important post. Excited and grateful, Tiny thanked the Lord for the opportunity. After leaving the castle, Tiny began training in preparation for the arrival of the guest. He was worried because the estate lord and Kron were both stronger than him. However, in just 3 days, Tiny had already become much stronger and more flexible than he was in his previous life. When the Grandmaster arrived at Tiny's training ground, he was ordered to follow him to a treasure room filled with expensive armor and weapons. Tiny asked if he could find something similar to his sword, and the Grandmaster proudly boasted about his luxurious artifact item made by the Master of Sword, Rogers himself. Upon seeing the sword, Tiny thought it suited him even more after the Grandmaster's appraisal. When Tiny remarked that good weapons should be wielded by the skilled, and for the sake of the estate leader, the Grandmaster became angry. In response, Tiny challenged the Grandmaster to a duel for his swords. He declared that if he were to lose, he would offer his life to the Grandmaster, which only infuriated him further. After a while, the guards overheard Tiny apologizing to the Grandmaster and promising to be more careful in the future. When Tiny emerged from the room, he was badly beaten and had to lean on his sword, which was covered with clothes. The guards pitied him, but they decided not to intervene to save themselves. When a maid in the castle asked how he received his injuries, Tiny replied that the Grandmaster asked him to give him something, and this altercation occurred between them. The maid advised him to rest and offered to help him with anything he needed. In the estate lord's room, the lords asked the maid about the sacrifice and whether any corpses from the wolf gang were involved. The maid confirmed that there were corpses, and the lord concluded that Tiny had caused quite a mess. However, once Tiny's bloodline was confirmed after a few days, his path to success would be opened. The only issue was that if Tiny wasn't from the family they thought he was, as the supervisor of the wolves, he would have to pay for the consequences. That night, the estate lord was awoken by an alert magic that disturbed his sleep. He woke up angry but was caught off guard when Tiny attacked him with a sword. The lord was pierced by the sword and died on the spot. The next morning, all the knights arrived on the scene and detected traces of demonic energy. One of the knights asked why the estate lord's body looked like it had been dead for weeks, and the reply was that the black magician's body rots right away after they die. Everyone was horrified by the lord's death, but there was nothing they could do now. The sword that killed the lord was recognized as belonging to the Grandmaster. The knights began to argue about whether the Grandmaster and Lord had argued about who should be appointed as the new Grandmaster, causing the Grandmaster to become furious and take a hasty step. Although some denied this possibility, they found it strange that the Grandmaster hadn't shown up. The knights began to investigate the case and found out from the maids and guards that the Grandmaster had beaten Tiny and besides interrogated Tiny for further information. Tiny explained to the knight that the estate lord was going to give him an armor suit, so he went to see it, but the Grandmaster suddenly attacked him and beat him up. He didn't even get the armor. In an angry tone, the knight revealed that they had investigated the storage room and found traces of the fight, but the Grandmaster had left the place. The knight asked Tiny if he had seen the Grandmaster after the incident, but Tiny replied that he hadn't seen him since then. Tiny then asked what would happen to him as the estate lord had assured him of his safety. The knight handed Tiny a mercenary plaque and some money so that he could move to another land freely. The plaque, made by the knight, would assure others of his identity. The knight also advised Tiny to venture out into a bigger ocean, as staying in this place would be a waste of his talent. Tiny thanked him for his advice. Since a black magician has appeared, the imperial family will soon take action. The Duke's investigation team won't be coming either, so Tiny has to go there by himself. The knight tells Tiny to remember his name if he becomes successful. Tiny asks for his name, shocking the knight. He introduces himself as Gren Liberty, and tells him to remember him as Gren. Tiny leaves the palace, saying Gren to remember him as well. Since both the estate lord and Grandmaster are gone, the future of Files depends on that knight. Tiny feels sorry for him for leaving behind a mystery that can never be solved. He decides to meet the Sword Emperor as he has successfully taken his revenge for his sister. He gets back on the Lunar Wolf as they venture towards their goal. In his past life, disasters occurred one after another across the whole continent, as if they were foretelling the advent of the Demon King's army, greatly weakening the strength of humankind. It all started with the disappearance of Karun's relic, 7 sacred relics that were bestowed upon humanity by the goddess. They were supposed to be humanity's final resort, but all of them were stolen in his past life. Tiny needs to protect Karun's relic and get stronger as he gets through the disasters. In the estate lord's castle, a dark magician appears and knocks the guard down. He heads towards the knight and says he wants to ask him something. He hypnotizes the knight to tell him everything he knows about this incident regarding the assassination of the estate lord. After the knight explains everything to him, he orders the knight to fall asleep and wake up after an hour. After waking up, the knight thinks he might have pushed himself too hard. The guard informs the knight about the missing body of the estate lord, which was the most important lead towards the black magic. In the forest outside the castle, the owner of the sword, the Grandmaster, was already found dead. The black magician concludes that the culprit was the one who killed the wolf, a black-haired kid who disappeared after the incident. He will make Tiny pay for the price for ruining their work, no matter what. By that time, Tiny has reached the Lucentia Castle West Gate. He visits a weapon shop where he buys an armor made from the leather of an iron bull. He hears people talking about the Princess of Valentia coming to patrol around the streets. In the past, when he got a chance to meet the Princess of Valentia, she couldn't recognize him as Tiny, saying he was too big for that name. But this time, when they meet again, she is going to remember him in this life and ask her for a favor for meeting the Sword Emperor. The princess is surrounded by her guards when Tiny appears to meet her. He shows her a ring that was given to him by the princess and asks her for a favor. Thank you for watching until the end. Please subscribe to the channel if you want to find out what happens next. The princess is attacked by the dark magician. Will Tiny be able to protect the princess? Will the Sword Emperor recognize Tiny from the future? I hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to like the video and comment on your thoughts on the manhwa. I picked a hammer to save the world.